Can Russia rebound like Germany? An in-depth analysis. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has cost the world nearly $1 trillion in damages during the conflict. The conflict has seen both sides invest billions of dollars in military equipment and destroy billions of dollars of critical infrastructure inside and outside the conflict zone. All this to continue the invasion and, above all, to achieve the final victory. The total number of casualties on both sides fighting this war is approaching 500,000. If you find the video you watch useful, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and support us with a donation. Your help is precious to us and will allow us to continue producing quality content for you. You can do it here below, through the appropriate buttons, subscribe, and thanks. Unfortunately, at the moment there is no end in sight to this conflict. One of the most productive things that governments, non-governmental organizations, and public opinion around the world should do now is to plan what will happen to the countries involved after the end of the fighting. This is probably one of the most effective ways to ensure that similar events do not happen again, without intervening directly in the conflict. The reconstruction of war-torn Ukraine will cost about $500 billion, but tragically such a high bill cannot be covered by international aid. Inevitably, the burden will fall on the Ukrainian people or on Russia through war reparations. In either case, the consequences will be severe. Ukraine has not always been a rich country. In fact, it was the poorest country in Europe. The estimated reconstruction costs alone are equivalent to more than 2 years of Ukraine's entire economic output before the war. To understand it more simply, it is as if Ukraine had managed to dedicate its entire economy to the reconstruction effort at the expense of all other economic functions, including providing food to the population. It will take even more than 2 years to return to the starting point. This assumes that the shocking loss of capital and labor has not reduced economic capacity. In reality, Ukraine will pay the price of this war for decades. The same goes for Russia. Of course, being on the side of the belligerents in this war, it is difficult to sympathize with this country. The long-term economic difficulties that will follow the end of the conflict can only cause further problems. Certainly, it would be satisfying, if not entirely fair, for Russia, which is much richer, to pay for the damage it has caused. However, as history has taught us, war reparations imposed by the victorious powers do not always have an optimal effect. It is still a solution worth exploring. There are also less common solutions. One example is that the developed countries of the world help both countries change course so that they can return to being productive members of the global economy. This has already been done since the end of World War II, and if handled well, it could lead to more productive and peaceful results for all. It would be better to have another Germany or another Japan and another North Korea. In choosing this destiny, the economy will play an important role. Can the economies of Russia and Ukraine reasonably recover from this war over the course of our lifetime? One of the most promising options for restoring the economic functioning of the region is to provide economic aid to Russia as well. Even if this could encourage other countries to start hostilities when they see similar actions rewarded. Russia projects an image of economic and military strength to the world, but in reality, apart from its abundant natural resources and its vast nuclear arsenal, it is far behind the true global powers in both sectors. Even if Russia manages to rebuild a functioning economy after the war, it will be a new economy, not a return to normalcy. Many difficult lessons will have to be learned to build a diversified and stable economy after the war. We experienced the Industrial Revolution much later than the countries of Western Europe, and even then we were far behind. Only in 1861 was serfdom abolished, with peasants serving landowners, who were aristocrats. Since then, the USSR has embraced industry and continued to grow, but the surprising concentration of new wealth still belonged to the aristocracy, and at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the USSR was still predominantly agricultural. By focusing on heavy industry, the USSR expanded beyond the agricultural sector and became the second largest economy in the world at the time, but in the years following World War II, it was still far behind the United States and much less wealthy per capita than France, Britain, Germany, and even Japan. This has more to do with demographics than with economic management. The USSR lost by far the largest number of soldiers during World War II, estimated at 811 million in combat and 24 million civilians. After the war, the USSR lost a significant portion of its young labor force and was forced to develop its economy. In the USSR, almost 70% of men born in 1923 died before the end of the war, some due to the conflict, others due to disease and malnutrition. In any case, the losses were devastating from a human perspective, but from the perspective of a cold economist, a lot of labor was lost that could not be employed to rebuild and run the economy. Many were also injured and unable to provide the same level of productivity as able-bodied people. The effects of World War II are still present in the population charts of the former Soviet countries, such as Russia and Ukraine, and reverberate through the generations. Land, labor, and capital are the economic factors of production necessary to make anything. After the war, Ukraine lost most of its capital and a devastating percentage of its labor force. When half a century later the Soviet Union collapsed, a series of failed economic plans, costly wars, and internal problems had left the average Russian in poverty on a global scale. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the new Russian Federation was formed, the government embarked on a fundamentally distorted privatization process, with people close to the government seizing highly profitable state industries at the expense of ordinary Russians. With very few exceptions, private ownership of any business was illegal in the Soviet Union. Workers in the system received only modest wages to buy a few luxuries. When Russia attempted to privatize the 45,000 state organizations that ran most of the country's industries, it encountered problems. If it had sold its state-owned enterprises to foreign investors, it would have effectively ceded its economy to countries that only a few years earlier had been global rivals. But if they had sold them to their own citizens, they would not have had the funds to buy them. One of the solutions devised by the new Russian government was to distribute privatization vouchers to all citizens, including children, in exchange for shares in state-owned companies. The problem was that many Russian citizens at the time were desperately poor and did not have the skills to understand how the new financial markets worked. They therefore traded these vouchers for food and small amounts of money. For the most part, criminals who ran the black market before the collapse of the Federation siphoned off the country's wealth through various means. Eventually, Russian public opinion understood what had happened and still today questions the annulment of privatization efforts in the early 1990s. When Putin came to power, he shook up the oligarchy, which increased his popularity. But in reality he simply replaced the cronies of the deposed government with his own. Wealth inequality in Russia remains one of the most pronounced in the world today, with the few remaining basic industries from the Soviet era still representing the majority of the Russian economy. The country's vast wealth of natural resources is enough to fill the pockets of the circles of power, while its reputation for corruption, political instability, and clientelistic capitalism is enough to discourage investment in sectors that do not involve extraction from the ground. Before the imposition of sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine, the most advanced Western companies operated in Russia to sell goods in exchange for petrodollars or to participate directly in the natural resources sector. Few organizations seek to establish structures in Russia for other purposes. In 2021, Russian exports consisted mainly of natural resources. Exports with value added from production processes and intellectual inputs accounted for less than 10% of total exports, most of which were military equipment. Even if it is not the first thing that comes to mind when talking about the Russian economy, Russia is a true oil state, only with the theme of the tundra instead of the desert. In many ways, the simplicity of the Russian economy has been its salvation in the face of the most intense global sanctions in history. Developed countries that depend on imports of raw materials, value-added and international services, or that are simply tourist destinations, are much more susceptible to sanctions than countries like Russia, whose economy is largely based on income from internal resources. Russian oil and gas are no different from oil and gas from other producing countries in the world. And there are many neutral countries that are happy to buy cheap fossil fuels to power their own national industries. The conflict has certainly affected the Russian economy, but its collapse has been slower than many in the West had hoped, because the conflict was not particular or complex and because Russia has been able to deal with neutral customers. The assessment of the path to economic recovery and how a country like Russia can reintegrate as a productive economic actor on a global level will depend on what the country is trying to recover from: a complete collapse or a minor setback. However, it would be foolish to assume that the Russian economy has not been affected by the current sanctions, in addition to the normal costs of a large war. Today, Russia is facing many of the same challenges it has faced throughout its history. Even the modernization of the economy is lagging behind, and advanced sectors have not developed to the same extent as in Western countries and the Asia-Pacific region. Political stability is even lower, and the country is losing much of its most productive labor force. No one knows who will be the leader of Russia in 2 years and what his political style will be. The challenges to Putin's leadership have been going on practically since he took office. The challenges to Putin's leadership have continued substantially since he took office. The government, which recently faced a large-scale armed revolution, is at best shaky in its foundations. To be honest, no one can predict the future, but in such an uncertain scenario, it is likely that no one will invest in the Russian economy unless it is in sectors that can only exist in Russia. To rebuild and grow a competitive international economy, Russia needs a stable government that inspires confidence. A stable government is not the same as a government that simply maintains power in the long term. Countries like Russia need to build industries that can guarantee constant production and give employment to a larger percentage of the population. Oil and gas generate a lot of added value, but if 50% of the economy depends on fossil fuel exports and their price drops by 50%, the economy could fall into a severe recession if drastic measures are not taken. Industries such as high technology, finance, and simple manufacturing still have their ups and downs, but they employ more people and the economy is not at the mercy of the price of a single raw material. In some ways, the war itself has had an unexpectedly positive impact on the Russian economy. In the last 30 years, Russia has had a very small number of extremely rich oligarchs, a small middle class composed mainly of employees in the natural resources sector and related sectors, and most of the population did not earn much. The median income in Russia is about $6,000 a year, which means that half of Russians live on less than this amount. This does not seem to be the case if we consider the regions of Russia most often seen abroad. Large cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg resemble any other large city in the developed world. This is because Russian wealth is not only highly concentrated, but also highly concentrated in some regions. The large areas rarely visited by foreigners are extremely poor former Soviet societies, with devastating social problems, or are inhabited by semi-autonomous peasant communities. Only 2.7 million people are employed in the extraction of natural resources in Russia, and this figure somehow includes contractors of conditioning plants. This is only a small part of Russia's total population of 143 million, and those who are not employed in this sector have so far been left behind. Ironically, it is the war itself that has provided the best job opportunities for those who have been left on the sidelines in Russia for 30 years. If Russia wants to rebuild a better economy in the post-war period, it could learn this lesson. It is important to ensure that the wealth of the country's natural resources benefits the entire population, not just the few who buy the country or another small group lucky enough to get a job in the only industry that makes serious money. Using military spending to pay soldiers is nothing new for a package of government stimuli. We talked about it more in depth in our video on the true costs of the global arms race. But there is a more efficient way to proceed. If the new Russia that emerges after the war manages to convince the world that it is a stable and worthy country to embrace new industries, it could use oil wealth to co-invest in new industries and promote economic diversification. Ensuring sufficient stability to develop new business opportunities would also help address what is probably the biggest demographic challenge of the post-war period. Hundreds of thousands of young people have been killed or injured in the conflict, and hundreds of thousands more have fled Russia for fear of being forced to serve in the military or simply for a better life in a country free from the toughest sanctions in history. Even before the start of the war, Russia was facing population contraction and aging. Once again, the natural resources sector, with its limited need for labor in the face of high economic production, has cushioned the problem. However, if Russia wants to build a diversified economy, it needs a productive labor force, a difficult path given that much of the country's best and youngest workers have fled the country or have been dispersed in the ongoing conflict. Russia will also struggle to attract talent from abroad, as it does not speak a common language. In short, what skilled workers would want to move to Russia to build a better life for themselves and their families? Once again, it all depends on guaranteeing stable governance. Russia has remained a world power despite levels of corruption and mismanagement that would have condemned most other countries. Of course, it is easy to think that the only positive outcome of the ongoing struggle is to become a superpower like North Korea. After all, they brought it upon themselves, and historically, one of the most effective ways to ensure peace is to promote economic cooperation through interdependent industries. A unilateral exchange of resources could be a good start, but as the current conflict shows, it is not a safe bet. Of course, no one, not even economists, can predict the future, but post-war reconstruction efforts, such as those undertaken in Western Europe and Japan after World War II, are quite possible in Ukraine and Russia. The reconstruction of Russia would undoubtedly be unpopular, but it could serve a similar purpose. In 1945, the world was divided into two factions: the capitalists, informally led by the United States, and the communists, informally led by the USSR. Today, the world is closing in again, and important countries, including Russia, are moving away from the global trade and industry that have defined the last 30 years. What was your experience with the topic covered in this video? Tell us about it in the comments. We are curious to know. And if you have any doubts or questions, don't hold back. Leave a comment. Even just a simple like would be perfect. But most importantly, subscribe to the channel to stay informed about upcoming releases.